Everybody, sorry I'm not there today. If you remember, on Friday we were talking about the difference between plot and interpretation, and we were looking at the poem My Papa's Waltz, and a couple of you gave me some ideas about what the poem is about, the plot, the literal action of the poem, and then we also talked about some interpretation, some things that are not explicitly stated by the words of the poem but you think might be true. So we talked about how the father might be an alcoholic, or that the child might actually be enjoying this dance and others thought it was more abusive or more scary for the child. So many different interpretations are possible, as long as you can support it by the text in a reasonable way. And then we talked just a little bit about different interpretations of the line, how he hung on like death. So what I'd like you to do next, now that you've seen that there are multiple different possible interpretations for many pieces of plot, is for you to try. So you can do this with a partner if you like, or you can do it on your own in your notes, and Mark will come around and just check up on you and make sure that you're able to get three. So the first interpretation kind of question I want you to answer is, why do you think that the speaker's father has whiskey on his breath? And I want you to come up with three possible scenarios, three interpretations that you think could be supported, even if you tend to believe one more than the others. Come up with three different ones. And then another question, why do you think the knuckle of the speaker's father is battered? Why does the poet use that word choice to describe the speaker's father's hand in that way? So three different ones for that. And Mark, you can just pause the video at this point and allow the students to work on it until they each get them. You can work with a partner or on your own. Okay, so what you're going to focus on next is writing interpretive sentences. And interpretive sentences is a term that I use to describe the integration of quotations into your writing for support. And this is a really key skill to learn and to develop in your time in high school English, because your teachers will be expecting you to integrate and interpret lots of different kinds of pieces of literature in order to analyze them. So some do's and don'ts with interpretive sentences, and I'd like you to copy down the do and don't list into your notes. So Mark, if they need a little more time, you can just pause the video after I finish going through them. So interpretive sentences do's. You do want to combine plot and interpretation into one sentence. So you might be wondering how to do that, but never fear, we will practice it today and tomorrow, or next class rather. Another do is to focus on your idea, your interpretation. So while it's great to have evidence and you want to use that piece of the text, that quotation, to support your ideas, what's really important is your idea. So you don't want to use so much of the quote or focus so strongly on the quote that your ideas about the story, the poem, the novel, the play, etc. get lost. And then finally, you want to make sure that you cite properly. So we use MLA format, it's called, Modern Language Association format, in most English classes. So that's what you'll be using this summer. So if you have a quotation, you put it in the quote marks like you see here. You put a parenthesis and then either the line number if it's a poem, or page number if it's a novel or short story or so forth. And notice that you don't have to put P or PG or anything if it's a page. You just put the number and then the parenthesis and then the period. So what are some things to avoid? Again, I want you to copy these don'ts into your notes for today. So you don't want to separate plot and interpretation. You don't want to have those hanging out differently in different sentences in your writing. You also don't want to just retell the plot. You know, again, the focus is on your ideas about the plot, why it's significant. So if you're just telling me what happens in the story or the poem, that's not enough to analyze. And finally, don't use the quotation as the subject of your sentence. So using those do's and don'ts lists, I want you to evaluate for Mark, what do you think here? Are some of these good or bad? So as you are listening to me read them, you can hold up a finger for one and two fingers for two, and Mark can kind of tally in her head what she thinks the consensus is, and you can move on. So what do you think? Is this good or bad? In the beginning of the poem, the speaker dances with his father, saying, "I hung on like death." Line 4. This shows that he is scared of his abusive father. So what do you think? Good or bad? Okay, so this one is bad, and there are a couple of reasons. One is it's separating the plot and the interpretation into two different sentences. So in the first sentence we've got the plot, and the second one we've got interpretation. It's not the biggest mistake you can make in writing by any means, but I want to show you how to make those flow together more smoothly. The second problem is that we have something called a pronoun reference error here, and that's with the word this. You know that the definition of a pronoun is a word that takes the place of a noun. So in this case, the word this is actually referring back to this entire previous sentence. So that is grammatically incorrect, and it's also just vague. Anytime you're using this in a sentence, I would encourage you to check and make sure it's just standing in the place of one word. So you want to try to avoid using this so generally. All right, let's see another one. The author writes that the speaker says that he hung on like death. This shows he is scared. This means that his father may be abusive. Good or bad? And just remember that I'm asking you to think about the structure of the sentences, not about the interpretation. You might think that the sentence is great, but you don't agree with the interpretation. Don't think about the content, okay? Just think about, in terms of writing, is this a good or bad interpretive sentence? Okay, this one is also not strong. It starts off with the author writes that, which is sort of unnecessary. We can just focus on the speaker for the purpose of the poem. Also have the same this problem, this shows, this means. It's referring back to the entire previous quotation, so we want to avoid that error, which is called a pronoun reference error. It's a little bit short, a little bit choppy with those short sentences, and again, we have separated plot and interpretation into two separate, or in this case, three separate sentences, which we want to avoid. How about this one? In the beginning of the poem, the speaker dances with his father, noting that he hung on like death, also saying that his father's breath smelled of whiskey. What do you think about that one? Okay, so this one is also bad. You may be seeing a pattern here. The problem here is that we are just retelling the plot. So we have, this is what happens, the speaker dances, he also talks about the whiskey, so there's no interpretation there. That's actually only plot. So that's something we're going to try to avoid from our don't list. And here's another one. I think this is the last one. I hung on like death shows that the speaker is fearful of his father. Good or bad? Okay, and this one is bad because it uses the quotation as the subject of the sentence. It doesn't maybe feel as jarring because this quotation is kind of short, so it is not as confusing as it could be if the quotation were longer, but it's still something you want to try to avoid. One thing that's good about this sentence is that we've got some interpretation integrated. The speaker is fearful of his father. That's not a plot element. That's something that this writer has interpreted. So it does have that one good quality. So as we've been looking at, the idea is that you want to keep plot and interpretation in one sentence, not separate them out with those little brackets kind of indicating what a sentence would look like. So I'm going to show you two tried and true sentence constructions that will help you to create sentences that follow the do guidelines and avoid the don't guidelines for interpretive sentences. And those are using an opening dependent clause and a present participle. And if you're not familiar with those grammar terms, don't worry too much about it. I'll explain them briefly, but really what's more important is that you see the patterns that I'm showing you and you'll get a chance to practice them. So an opening dependent clause happens at the start of the sentence, hence the word opening. It's a group of words with both a subject and a verb. Clauses are something you're going to take notes on later. And it begins with a subordinating conjunction. We talked briefly about subordinating conjunctions when we reviewed the parts of speech. So words like when, since, because, while, although, those are all subordinating conjunctions that join one part of the sentence to another. So here's an example of an opening dependent clause. You don't need to write this down yet. When the speaker explains that he hung on like death, he reveals his fear of his father, clinging desperately to this man who smells dangerously of whiskey. So a number of things that this sentence construction is doing well. Number one, it's combining plot and interpretation into one sentence. Number two, it's citing properly with the line 4 from the poem. Number three, it's really emphasizing the author's interpretation, because if you look at the main part of the sentence here, is he reveals his fear of his father, clinging desperately to this man. So he's interpreted the line of the poem and really built the sentence around that interpretation without just focusing on the plot that the speaker hung on like death. So now I'd like you to practice, and I've given you 2 lines that I want you to interpret. So here's where you want to write this into your notes. When the speaker notes, my mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. And remember, we talked on Friday about how countenance means face or expression. He what? So he reveals, he shows, he explains, and then I want you to interpret something from that sentence. Now, if you wanted to, you could flip this. And if you didn't want to talk about the speaker, you could talk about the mother, so you could change he to she. When the speaker notes, "My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself," she reveals, if you want to say something about her. But in either case, we can pause the video now and give all of the students a chance to write their own opening dependent clause. Okay, so hopefully you feel a little more comfortable with the opening dependent clause construction. We're going to finish up with the present participle construction. A participle is a kind of word class called a verbal, and that means that it has qualities of a verb. It originally came from a verb, but we add this ing ending, and now it's functioning as an adjective in the sentence. So with a present participle construction, you've got a participle plus the quotation, then a comma and a subject. So here's an example. Explaining, "I hung on like death," line 4, comma, "the speaker reveals his fear of letting go, his dread of his rough, drunk father." So again, you may disagree with the interpretation here. I just want you to pay attention to the construction of the sentence. We've got this explaining, that's our present participle, the ing word. Then we've got the person doing the explaining after the quote. So explaining, the quote, citation, then the subject of the sentence here is the speaker, who's the one doing the explaining, and then the author goes on to interpret. And I like how the author did some parallel structure there. That repetition, his fear of, his dread of, is a nice touch. So, time for you to practice. And again, I'm just using the same quote that we used for the dependent clause, so you can even use the same interpretation if you'd like. Just practice putting it into this other structure. So copy the entire example of present participle down into your notes. Remarking, "My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself," line 7, 8, comma, "the speaker," and then go on to interpret. Or again, you could use the mother if you preferred. You can stop here to practice. Okay, and so for the final thing today, I want you to use your own quotes, okay? So pick some lines from the poem that you found significant, and you can write one of each type. If you'd like to use the same quote for both, like I did in my example, you can, but you don't have to, either way. So just note that I have some examples here of the words that you can use, but you're not limited to these. So if you want to use a different verb, if you want to use a different conjunction, that's totally fine. So you can say, "As the speaker observes," or "because the speaker explains, he displays." You know, you can go on and on. You don't have to use just these. So you've got one opening dependent clause to write and one present participle to write completely on your own, and then you're going to turn those into mark when you're finished. Just to sum up, remember you want to try to combine and plot and interpretation in one sentence, and use those two constructions, opening dependent clause or present participle, as ways to follow the guidelines that I've given you. And finally, you want to avoid that pronoun reference error with this. And I'll put this back up in case you haven't written your sentences yet. Thanks.